I really appreciate the invitation here. We know we've seen a number of grad students at Chicago who got their BAs here, very well-trained, smart people, and I've always wondered where are they coming from? And now I see where they've come from. Keep it up, guys, because we appreciate you. Today I'm going to discuss the fairly recent past and the present and the future of the U.S. labor market. And I'm going to begin with the question of why it contracted so much and why 7 years out or more it remained depressed. And I'm going to give you a feel for my kind of search for answers or inevitably partial answers using a methodology that's quite familiar from labor economics and macroeconomics. Now, of course, there have been many theories of the recession, many of them clever, but rarely do you get a flavor for how important they are quantitatively. Does the clever theory explain 2% of what happened, or 20%, or 80%? What I want to do today is a bit of a quantitative exercise. And we're going to have to look at some numbers so we can understand how important some of these factors are, not just whether they exist, but are they important. So I've projected on the screen here one of the charts from the book, and it's measuring labor economic performance from 27 to the end of 2013. And you see the two gray and black series. Those are the most commonly cited every month in the media measures of employment. And then the red series is a measure of total hours worked, which is a combination, of course, being employed and then how many hours each employee works. We can see that the hours measure, the red one, it fell 10% at its trough, if you will. And the employment measures both agree that employment fell on a per capita basis about 7%. And then in 2013, which was almost 7 years later, it still had not recovered, haven't even recovered half. So let's look at that question of what might have contributed to this phenomenon and how can we measure it. So the first clue I looked at in the book, I wish I had more time to talk about it today, was productivity. We can learn a lot from productivity patterns in the economy. And one thing I noticed from those patterns is that employers were acting like they thought employees had gotten more expensive rather suddenly. And they weren't necessarily acting like they didn't have enough customers. Instead, it appears like from their actions, not their words necessarily, but from their actions that they want to satisfy their customers like they always had, but do it in a less labor-intensive way, to do it with less labor. That's what the productivity was telling me. Now, that doesn't give us an answer by itself, but it's our first clue into the mystery, if you will. So the next thing I did is, well, I have some understanding of things that make labor more expensive to employers. So I wanted to start with those things that we have an understanding of, and those are redistribution in the forms of either safety net programs or minimum wages. Those are things that, as I will explain this afternoon, they make labor more expensive. And the question is, did these things change during the time period we looked at? And if so, how much? And so we'll do that measurement exercise this afternoon. And we'll see how much redistribution changed. It did change. And then we'll adjust for really what are known effects of redistribution. We know that redistribution has effects on the economy, and we'll try to figure out, well, the redistribution we got, how much would we expect it to change the economy and how? And there the rather surprising answer is that redistribution is the single biggest factor depressing the labor market as I measured in those three different ways on the previous slide. The last thing, clue number 4, I wish I had more time to talk about. But the last thing I did is, in the book, is to look at, say, hey, redistribution doesn't hit every type of person in the same way. It affects some groups more than others. For example, and maybe surprisingly, it affects unmarried people more than married people. So then what I did is looked at the work hours, kind of the data I showed you, broken down by groups, and look at how deep was the recession for unmarried people. Was it more or less deep than it was for unmarried people? And if there are differences, are those differences consistent with the types of redistribution that happened? So that's kind of the pathway of investigation in the book. One thing I don't like about this metaphor, this kind of crime metaphor, is to make it sound like that there's a guilty party who needs to be caught and punished. And there I think you've strained the metaphor, so I thought to try to correct for that kind of bias in this metaphor, we'd start out kind of with the motive. What are some of the reasons why redistribution would change during this period? And then I think when you look at it from that perspective, it's not clear that there's a bad guy who needs to be caught. We're just getting clues about what happened, not necessarily who was the bad guy. So here I'm going to compare two economic variables. You might call them safety and labor market efficiency. Because the reason why redistribution can affect the economy is that when you're helping people, and helping people is intrinsically valuable. We like helping people. We like knowing that could be help there when we get in trouble. So there's intrinsic value to helping people. But one of the consequences of helping people is that they'll tend to do less to help themselves. And that's why there's a trade-off. The more you help people, the less they're going to do to help themselves, and less efficient the labor market is. So there's a trade-off here. Trying to kind of lay that out in red. At one extreme, you could say there's going to be no help. Everybody's on your own. Fully self-reliant is the way I indicated in the graph here. But that's an extreme, to be clear, in the way I've drawn it. At the other extreme is people don't rely on themselves at all. They rely on others. That help is how they live, and not what they do themselves doesn't affect how they live. You might call that communism or something, or a kibbutz, where really you're relying on the others to provide for you, not for yourself. And that's another extreme. And real economies aren't at either of these extremes. Even so-called communist countries aren't at either of these extremes. They're somewhere in between. And really, as an economist, I can't really say where the right place to be is on this trade-off. I can just say that there's a trade-off. Now, I thought it'd be good to maybe watch a little YouTube clip that illustrates this trade-off and explains from one man's perspective how he saw that helping people during the recession caused them to do less to help themselves. So this is this gentleman, Mr. Reese. He's, you might call him a headhunter or a recruiter. His job, he is hired by corporations to find new workers. And they describe to them the job that they have, and it's his job to find the workers, screen them, and the corporation just can put them to work. He does that recruiting process, and he's not an economist, he's not a social scientist, so he doesn't look at things the way we do, but it's interesting to hear what he had to say, what he was observing in the economy right around 2009, right around at the depth of the labor market as I measured it earlier. So this should pop up a YouTube clip.
In late 2009, we began to see hiring returning to the economy. We were hit head-on with a hurdle we didn't anticipate. We had applicants applying for jobs, but only to protect their status for unemployment insurance. Just To turn down the job, applicants would use the regulation related to earning a reasonable percent of their previous pay. The reasonable distance to travel to work was also a factor utilized to turn down a job. If it was more than 25 miles, they didn't have to take it. If it was 26.5, they didn't have to take it. If it was 19.5, then they had to consider it. Our staff believed that these applicants were possibly unemployable to begin with, but as they looked more closely, they found that most of the applicants were very skilled, capable, and had been on prior jobs for several years before being laid off. Prior to the recession, clients were willing and able to pay wages that were above the prevailing market rates. We have found that the unemployed who are holding out and choosing to stay on unemployment now face the reality that those jobs will no longer pay what they once earned. They will look our recruiters in the eyes and state, well, I'll just stay on unemployment. One of our clients that has multiple manufacturing, assembly, and distribution facilities across the United States, and they employ thousands of employees across the country, had this to say, quote, we've actually had applicants say that they had done the math and that they were not willing to work for $10 an hour because their unemployment check, coupled with gas savings, lunch, and uniforms, made it more attractive to stay home. The way they saw it, they would be working for $2.50 an hour above what they could get on unemployment, so they'd rather stay home.
So Mr. Reese has explained to us one way in which it became more expensive to be an employer during the recession, namely that employers now had to compete with new programs that were assisting people who might otherwise be workers. So that's an example. Remember I said the first clue showed us that, boy, employers are acting like employees are more expensive, but what made them more expensive? Well, Mr. Reese is starting to tell us that. Now we got to, as I said, Mr. Reese isn't a social scientist. So one thing that I think should be clarified is kind of his tone. His tone is, it's kind of the worker's fault. Well, markets don't assign fault. Okay, what we know that the number of jobs went down. And that's because, my way of thinking, that employers and employees couldn't reach a deal that's good for both of them. Mr. Reese makes it sound like, well, those employees are just kind of maybe lazy, ungrateful. He didn't use those words, but that was his tone you saw, that they wouldn't take the job that was offered because it only paid $250, he said. But the other side of that coin is, and he didn't say this because he doesn't want to critique his clients, but the corporations weren't upping their ante. When they were faced with a competition with these programs for the workers' time, they did not choose to raise their wage. So that instead of paying $250, maybe it paid $550. So not to say that it's the employer's fault either, but we have these new programs that got in the way, and are, as I will show you, continue to get in the way of deals between employers and employees. The third thing that he doesn't really mention, because remember, he's a recruiter, he's in charge of hiring people, not firing people. In that regard, he probably has a more fun job than those who are in charge of firing people. But assistance programs are also a subsidy to layoffs. The whole point of the programs, if you listen to the politicians, maybe we shouldn't, but if you listen to the politicians, the whole point of their programs are to make layoffs less painful. Well, guess what? When you make something less painful, employers and employees will do less to try to avoid it because it's less painful. It doesn't make it painless, but it's less painful, therefore you go to fewer lengths to try to avoid the situation. Like a business might decide to lower its prices to attract more customers and therefore retain more workers. But when the layoff is less painful, they might not do that. In fact, you had programs that I will discuss this afternoon that made employers very quickly realize that 2009 was an excellent time to lay people off, because normally when a corporation lays somebody off, they may be obligated to assist them with some severance payment, assist them with the health insurance, but that obligation disappeared in 2009 because the federal government was doing that. the federal government was giving people a more generous weekly check than ever. And the federal government was taking care of laid off people's health insurance. And so this was an excellent time to lay people off. They had been foolish to put off a layoff and say until 2011 or 2012. So you subsidize layoffs and you're going to get more layoffs. Mr. Reese didn't mention that because, as I said, it's not his job. But as an economist, we recognize that's what's happening. Now, what might have caused us to have these new programs? The new programs move us along the trade-off away from efficiency toward equity or safety. But why might we move that? Or mechanically, what causes us to move in that direction? Now, this slide tries to speculate on some answers. This is really a political side, so I got to say that I'm an amateur in that area, and I should defer to the professionals. But I thought it wouldn't be completed until we at least mention some of the possibilities. So one thing I think was happening, again, my amateur opinion, is that the will of the people was changing. And I say witness the change of the will of the people. They took the Senate majority away from Republicans, gave it to Democrats. In 2002, the representatives of the people adopted a new farm bill that dramatically expanded the food stamp program. There was a representative of the people doing that. Later, the Democrats won the House of Representatives. And that was the people who chose that. And Democrats are known to lean in the direction of equity or safety and away from the efficiency. And then finally, of course, Democrats won the presidency, the White House. And so people seem to be moving in this direction of wanting the party of safety or equity and less of the party maybe of efficiency. There are also economic events that kind of make you understand why the will of the people might have been evolving. Health care is getting more and more expensive, not less important to people, but more and more expensive. 2008 was pretty scary in terms of market dynamics and gyrations. And then you had the gap between rich and poor had been growing for a couple of decades by that point. So there are some really economic forces, I think, that we shouldn't be surprised if they change the will of the people. There's also a point of view, when I was in college, it was always viewed as a puzzle. Why do we have less safety and equity in the United States than they do in Europe? And scholars were scratching their heads and scratching their heads. Well, we don't have to scratch our heads anymore. Now we've moved to a system that has a lot of assistance kind of in a Western European style. So maybe it's kind of an inevitable. Really the question is, why did it take this long to do it the way the Western Europeans do? What I can say is I also witnessed some economic misunderstanding. The White House repeatedly said that we could have both equity and efficiency at the same time. There was no trade-off. That if we would do more to assist unemployed people, we'd actually get less unemployed people. If we did more to subsidize being in poverty, we would have fewer people in poverty. So there was a denial of that kind of trade-off. And that I can definitely refute and definitely say that there's a trade-off. It may be worth moving. Maybe the Western Europeans were wiser than us, but there's no free lunch. And if we're going to have more equity, we're going to have less efficiency. So in summary, my view of the events is before the recession, say in 2007, we were at a spot like this, some kind of balance that had been achieved over the years between equity and efficiency, an American type of balance. And then in the years after, and even today, we'd moved in the direction of more safety, more assistance, less efficiency. Okay, that's kind of the big picture. Now let's drill down a little bit and say, well, what exactly changed in the federal government to create more assistance and more safety and equity? Well, table 3.3 is from the book. It's hard to read. That's part of the point. This is a list of new statutes, new laws on the books, expanding the assistance that either unemployed people can receive or poor people can receive. I will zoom in a second so you can try to read that fine print, but I just wanted to get you a feel for the structure of these changes. Vertically, this table is broken up three ways. Unemployment insurance and related programs are in the top part. The middle part says SNAP. That's the new acronym for the food stamp program. And on the bottom, we have health assistance, especially Medicaid. Left and right, we have, on the left column, we have statutes that change the eligibility rules. The rules for being able to participate in the program. For example, the rules to say who can be on food stamps. In the right column, we have legislation that didn't necessarily change who can be in the program, but they changed how generous the program would be to people that are in it. And so we had new statutes there. These are new statutes, new laws. We went to new rules for assistance programs, and you'll see that they were rules in the direction of being more generous. So now I'm going to zoom in on the top, focus on the unemployment part for a second, unemployment assistance. Again, you see the columns, eligibility on the left, benefit amounts on the right. I've highlighted in red the 4 statutes that changed beginning in 2008, the length of time that you could receive unemployment assistance. Before 2008, you could only receive assistance for half a year, 26 weeks. The combination of these 4 laws changed that to up to 99 weeks. I'm sure a lot of you heard of this. In a sense, the 99 weeks of unemployment insurance is infamous, discussed over and over, even analyzed. But my point today is that's not all that happened. You can see there are statutes here without a red square around them, meaning they had nothing to do with 99 weeks. We have, on the right column, we have all the benefit amounts were changed, and the newspapers never talked about that the weekly benefit was greater for a number of reasons. And we even have some changes in the eligibility, meaning the rules for deciding who can receive an unemployment check. Those rules also changed apart from the 99-week issue. So to get a full picture of how much we move towards safety and away from efficiency, you got to consider the whole picture, not just the red boxes. And that doesn't even begin to mention programs that expanded that are not unemployment insurance. There are other programs like the food stamps where we had an expansion in the rules of who can be in the food stamp program or who can be receiving federal health assistance. Here's kind of the bottom line, if you will. The pink line on the bottom is showing us, as a result of law changes, how much a person who's out of work or underemployed can receive in assistance on average. This is an average because there are many different family situations that come in. But before the recession, if you were out of work, on average, you would receive $650 a month. And that went up to about $950 in 2009 and 2010, and then came back down somewhat. The other lines above that bottom line, if you will, add in some other factors other than federal government assistance programs like programs related to debts and mortgages. And then the top line in the dark red adds on taxes that recognizes that when you're out of work, not only can you get some assistance in terms of cash or food stamps or health, but you also are asked to pay less tax. And that's also a form of help. Well, none of us ever mind getting some relief from our taxes. And so the top line is pretty important because it puts all these things together, including the taxes. If you measure it on the right axis, instead of measuring in dollars per month, I measure it as kind of a fraction of what you would earn if you were fully employed. And I call that a marginal tax rate or a replacement rate. The marginal tax rate before the recession, on average, was about 40%, meaning that when you went to work fully employed, the Treasury gained 40 cents for every dollar that you created, and you kept 60 cents. That rate went from 40 up to 48%, and then came down somewhat as some of these programs began to expire. It's gone back up again, as I will show you at the end of the talk today. So you had marginal tax rates increasing by about 8 points. what is the effect of that? Well, one way you can kind of triangulate it is to focus on the unemployment, the 99 weeks. So what I've done is I've broken down the $300-some a month, or the 8 points on the marginal tax rate, either metric you want to use. I've broken it down into the contribution of the different programs. And on the bottom, the single biggest one is the 99 weeks. I call it the UI duration. That's the single biggest factor. So if you could only look at one thing the federal government did, the 99 weeks is the right thing to look at. In that sense, the newspapers kind of had it right. The problem is that that's only a third of what was happening. So if you just look at the 99 weeks, as many analysts did, and you conclude, well, that added 1 point to the unemployment rate by making people go back to work more slowly, like Mr. Reese talked about, then you're left to conclude, hey, there's lots of points in the unemployment rate that we can't explain, and so we got to go somewhere else and think about shocks to demand or whatever that means. But you can see that that 1 point on the employment rate is missing. For every point it catches, it's missing at least 2 points because it misses all these other programs, the health insurance programs, the food stamp programs, the additions to UI benefits, and so on. Moreover, remember, Mr. Reese kind of only gave half the story. All these programs, not only do they slow the pace at which people go back to work, but they increase the pace of layoffs. So in a sense, what you read in the newspapers was only a sixth of the story. You only saw about a third of the assistance, and you were only looking at half of the effect of any of the assistance. So in that sense, it's kind of a sixth, a factor of 6 that we've missed out on. So that's one way to analyze it. That's not the primary way I do it in the book, but it kind of gives you a flavor for what's at stake here. The way I do it in the book is to go back to the economic literature on the effect of taxes on economic behavior, especially employment and work hours. Now, before I do that, let me whet your appetite a little bit. Here I've zoomed in on that red line that was showing us the change in the generosity of benefits over time as the law has changed. It's the same color I used before, dark red. And on top of this, I want to put the economy, the labor market. And I want to really take the chart that I started with today and flip it upside down and put it on here in black. So going up, when the black goes up, that means a smaller labor market, mainly less employment. And when the black goes down, as it did a little bit in the second half, that means more employment. And you can see it's a remarkable correlation here between when disincentives went up, the labor market went down. And when disincentives backed off, the labor market came off its troughs. So that's also kind of interesting. Although I don't primarily rely on this in the book either, this is kind of probably some of you are already calling the causality police and saying, hey, Casey is taking correlation to be causation. No, that's not what I did. You can stare at this thing all day long. You can use fancy econometrics. It's going to be next to impossible to figure out the degree to which, from this picture alone, the red line impacted the black rather than the black impacting the red or some other explanation. But the good news, we don't have to do that. We've been doing labor market research, quantitative labor market research for decades. Some people in this room have done it. Labor economists have been all over the question, what is the causal effect of tax rates on behavior? And that's the research that I use. Now, they haven't gotten to a precise answer, and we still have plenty to argue about, but what we're quite confident about is the effect isn't zero. And what that means, the fact that there's some effect on the red line and the back line, what that means is just because the policies responded to the labor market, and for sure they did. Just look at what Congress said and when they were doing it. They were reacting to the labor market. Their policies are reacting to the labor market. But that doesn't make the labor market immune to their policies. Not at all. That causal effect that we've been aware of is still there, and we have some idea how big it is. So that's what I did in this sort of picture, is to try to think about, well, based on prior labor economics research, prior research on the effect of tax changes on the labor market, what was the effect of these program expansions on how much people were working and how much they got paid. Now, this is a supply and demand diagram. The upward sloping lines are supply. I always say to the students, if you don't know what's going on in an exam, draw an upward sloping line and a downward sloping line, and label them correctly, please. The upward sloping line is supply, that's the correct labeling, and the downward sloping line is demand for labor. Horizontally, I'm measuring, as we always do in labor supply and demand, I'm measuring the quantity of labor. Vertically, I'm measuring something like the price of labor or the productivity of labor. This is a quantitative exercise, so I put the data on here. The origin refers to where the labor market was before the recession, 2007 Q4. And then I've put kind of the depths of the recession here, 2009 Q4, also as a data point. So the black squares are data, not theory. The supply and demand curves are theory. Now, the supply and demand theory really only needs 3 pieces of information to make a prediction as to what would be the effect of these programs on the labor market. Number one, you need to know, not necessarily in order, you need to know the slope of the demand curve. Okay? More important, you need to know the slope of the supply curve. The slope of the supply curve is telling us about the causal effect of taxes on the amount that people work. So that slope is pretty important here. Full disclosure, this picture, the slope is 1. If you look in the book, you can see analyses that use other slopes. Because I said we don't exactly know what this slope is. We know it slopes up, but we're not sure exactly how much. But here I drew it as 1. And then the third thing we need to know, I've already shown you, what is the effect of the new programs and incentives? And that's the vertical distance between the supply curves. How much do I shift up the supply curve from these programs? Well, it depends their effect on the marginal tax rate. And so I've shifted up this curve according to the number of marginal tax rate points that we saw during this period, which was 8. Now, the program expansions weren't the only thing going on. Population grew, productivity changed. People felt less wealthy, is measured by how much they consume. They were buying less. So those are also factored in here by shifting the supply and demand curves. So the prediction of the model, taking into account all the things that I just mentioned, is that the economy should have been right here. That the labor market should have shrank about 7%, and wages should have gone up maybe 4% above where they were. That's what the model predicts. The data says, remember I showed you the data says, well, actually the labor market shrank a bit more than that, and wages went up a bit more than that. So in a sense, the model explains only 3/4 of what was happening and leaves 1/4 unexplained. So this is giving you a flavor of how I came to that conclusion that safety net expansions, a vertical shift in the supply curve, is the single biggest factor. It's explaining about 3/4, maybe a half, maybe more than that, of what happened. There are other things that happened as well that would go into the 1/4, if you will. Another way to look at what's happening is to look at wages. Wages is the price in the labor market, and of course when we look at markets we want to look at quantity and price. However, when we do that, we have to recognize that this is a market that's taxed, and therefore it's a market where we have to look at both prices. Markets with taxes have a price that the demanders pay and a price that the suppliers pay, and they're not the same price. That's because of taxes. So that's why I have 2 series here. The black one is what the demanders of the labor, the employers, pay. That's the employer cost. And you can see employer cost went up somewhat relative to trend during this period. And that's kind of Mr. Reese's story. But the red one's important too. That's the reward to working, taking into account that a lot of what the employer pays goes to the treasury and not to the worker. And that plummeted. At its depths, the employee reward to work after taxes and subsidies fell 12%. That's not something that you can ignore. That's not something you can say is going to be rounding error or have no effect. And so this simple picture shows why we got to pay attention to redistribution when we want to have any kind of complete picture of what's happening. So to conclude, the safety net is suddenly and significantly more generous. And most of that extra generosity has nothing to do with the 99 weeks. The return to work fell a whole lot, about 12% at its trough, or 8 percentage points on the marginal tax rate, if you want to look at it that way. Another number is not in the book, but I thought I'd give it to you as a treat. 4 million potential workers because of these programs, were put in a situation where they could make more unemployed than employed. That's a lot, considering that unemployment in total was about 10 million. Once we recognize that we move towards safety, a whole bunch of things start to make sense. And I'm not going to name them all, but we can understand why this recession was -8 or 10 recession in percentage points, rather than being like the Great Depression where it was a -30, or rather than being like earlier recessions that were smaller. The reason is because this recession is fully commensurate with the amount of safety that we injected in the system. So the recession really, in my view, is largely a labor market phenomenon. Now, I could end here, but I have news for you, and that's if you like your weak economy, you can keep it. And here's why. The next big labor market event, in fact, within 5 days of the expiration of the 99 weeks of unemployment insurance, we started a new program called the Subsidies in the Affordable Care Act, or the health reform. And I'll give you just a flavor of that. 3 big pieces to that assistance. There's an employment test that tells most employees, although not all, that the law will not assist you unless you leave your job. Or the law will not assist you unless you move to part-time work. So that's a new incentive, or disincentive. For those people who are getting assistance, latest numbers I heard, that's up to 11 or 12 million. For them, they face a new 20% tax on their income. In addition to all the taxes they used to pay. They pay a new 20% tax, which means every time they earn $1, they have to pay 20 cents more for their health coverage, in addition to all the other taxes they have. So that's a big deal. And then there's also the individual mandate. So what we have going on here are some new taxes. 2 new employment taxes and a new income tax. And of course, if you're going to have new employment taxes, you're going to have less employment. And at least when this program is fully phased in, it's still kind of growing and maturing. But when it's fully mature, you're going to have less employment. And because it has income taxes, you're going to have less income or GDP. Let me give you an example, maybe somewhat of a nauseating example, but I will give you this example of some of the stark incentives that we started with last year. So what I want to do here is compare a person who's considering a full-time position versus a part-time position. Full-time is going to be in the left column, part-time in the right column. Both of these are going to have health insurance, but from different sources. The full-time position, the employer, ESI stands for Employer-Sponsored Insurance. They're going to be the source of insurance, because you're not allowed, as I said, if you're employed in a full-time position, to get assistance elsewhere if your employer has it. But if you're a part-time worker, you're eligible for the exchange coverage, or sometimes known as the Obamacare coverage. So that's one difference between these positions. Obviously, they're different in the amount of time you work. Part-time position is going to be 29 hours a week. Full-time position will be 40. They also may differ in terms of work expenses, whether it be commuting or childcare or something. I have some numbers in there. That's not that important. These numbers I'm going to show you from last year when there was no employer penalty. So the weird incentives that are going to pop out here have nothing to do with the employer penalty, which has been infamous and covered in the newspapers and whined about in Congress, which has its own set of problems for sure. But the problems I'm describing here are independent of that. The costs to the employer of these positions, I'm going to assume for simplicity that they're same on an hourly basis. Both employees cost $26 an hour, but of course the full-time employee works more hours. So the full-time position costs more on a per-year basis. Of course, you get more work out of a full-time employee as well. But the costs are different on an annual basis. What's especially different is how the health coverage is financed. The full-time position finances the health coverage from the employer and the employee. Either the worker or the employer, or generally the two of them together, pay for this coverage. The part-time position is entirely different. The employer pays nothing for that coverage. It's Obamacare coverage, and the federal treasury, the federal taxpayers, if you will, pay. I want to highlight, to be clear, we're talking about the same health of people. People going to the same hospital, the same doctor, question of how we're going to pay for it. So that in both of these, for a family of four, about $17,000 a year is the total spending on health. The question is how we're going to pay for it. I'm highlighting the federal taxpayer contributions. Taxpayers kicking in two ways for the part-time worker, $11,000 in premium assistance and $4,000 in out-of-pocket assistance. So by choosing the part-time position, an employee turns on about $15,000 worth of assistance that he wouldn't get in the full-time position, number one. Number two, he wouldn't have gotten a part-time position in the old days, meaning 2013 or 2012 or any year before that. So, of course, we all know people who are on the fence or have been on the fence between full-time and part-time work. What this law is doing is giving them a hard whack off the fence onto the part-time side. A hard whack, how hard of a whack? In this example, $15,000 a year worth of a whack. Now let's look at the bottom line. How much, based on these two positions, how much could the employee have to spend after taxes and health expenses, to spend on other things? Well, he'll have more to spend, about $29,000, if he chooses the part-time position. So let me soak that in. Let that soak in for a minute. You work more and you got more to spend. That's not how the economy is supposed to work. That could be extremely damaging to things like employment and hours and to productivity when we've put people in a situation where we're actually rewarding them for destroying value. And this is an example, and just one example of millions that happen in the law of how this can occur. So going back to the red series of showing the marginal tax rates or replacement rates from the stimulus programs, the assistance programs, we see that temporary peak there of about 8 points. Then it came down as they started to expire, but then beginning in 2013, we have the Affordable Care Act turning on. Now, since the Affordable Care Act turned on literally within days of some of the other programs turning off, I show you two series here. The black series shows what would have happened if the 99 weeks had stayed on. It didn't stay on, in fact. But just to show you how big the impact of the health reform is on the disincentives, I've drawn that hypothetical. And then EUC stands for the 99-week program. That disappeared, so it brought it down. But even so, we get rid of the 99 weeks, we bring in the Affordable Care Act. The net effect is for there be more disincentives than there really has been, except for a brief period in 2009. So the marginal tax rate is going to be up there around 47% by next year. And unless some kind of law has changed, it'll be that way forever. So I look forward to your questions. If you want to read more about these, of course, there's the Redistribution Recession book about the 2009 and 10 period. And then my book called Side Effects, it focuses on the health reform and economic performance going forward from this year. Thank you.